Makerspace can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and that's almost by design. A makerspace depends on the people using it and what their purpose and function is. But in general, a makerspace is a place that people can get hands-on learning, experimentation, creative thinking, just kind of undefined exploration through computer programs, through graphics, through hands-on sewing, through workshops, making, crafting, all of the above. So yes, Makerspace is a great opportunity in community libraries, providing the opportunity to people who wouldn't otherwise have access to a lot of the programs, equipment, offerings that they provide. Benefits of a makerspace in a library, again, for the library's sake, it further offers programming to the community, but it also brings in a more diverse user group, which of course strengthens any space in any community.
Makerspaces are definitely for a whole variety of people. Kids going there to do crafts and do hands-on things, to older people maybe just trying to go there and learn something for the first time or get more educated about something, and kind of everywhere in between. Makerspaces don't just have to necessarily be about making. I think the flexibility of the space allows a whole variety of things to happen. They can be, classrooms one moment, the next they can be shifted to being like an art room or a computer lab. So I think there's a whole bunch of different types of equipment that makerspaces can have. I think it all kind of comes down to what the users want or need. So for example, I think makerspaces could function as like additional computer labs if they needed to, where you can kind of learn software, bring in computers and set up as like a learning style classroom. There's opportunities to bring in sewing machines, to bring in art pieces, to bring in, just crafts. Otherwise, you can definitely include things like 3D printers. I think VR goggles can come into play. There's just a whole bunch of things that I think people want to interact with, want to learn about, want to try out. And so the beauty of makerspaces is they can be super open, super flexible. You can bring in things, take things out, and it just allows a huge opportunity for a whole variety of things to potentially happen.
Makerspace is another really key opportunity for a flex space within a library or a school or wherever makerspace may be considered. Kind of a hybrid of a lab or a classroom or a computer lab, meeting room, and kind of group studies and classes. One more pretty dedicated space for flexible programming within it.